Tonight, we're really pleased to have our three panelists here with us today who have really generously given their time to be with us. Wesley Grinham is a senior mentor and group work facilitator for vulnerable young people. He has lived experience in the criminal justice system and of restorative justice, and he's worked as a restorative justice facilitator to resolve conflicts within prison communities. And actually, it was something that he wrote on LinkedIn a little while ago about his experience personally of empathy and restorative justice that inspired this event tonight. So it's really wonderful to have him here today. Kimia Sadaatian is a doctoral student in the Department of Psychology at Stanford University. Trained as an interdisciplinary social psychologist, Kimia studies issues surrounding punishment, prejudice and empathy. Their research develops evidence-based tools to reduce punitive attitudes in education, policing and re-entry following incarceration. So really interested to hear more about that later. And Pete Wallace is an experienced trainer and senior restorative justice practitioner with Oxfordshire Youth Justice and Exploitation Service. He's written or co-authored several books on restorative justice, including one called Understanding Restorative Justice, which explores the role of empathy in restorative processes. And he's also one of our Mint House trustees, so it's wonderful to have him here. So, Pete, would you like to start? So I'm just letting more people in from the waiting room. I'll just put up your slides, just one moment.
Great, it's wonderful to be with you all tonight. I hope you can see the slides. If you could go on to the next one, Joy. My slides are actually all cartoons by a wonderful cartoonist called Joe Wilkins, who produced these for the books that Joy mentioned around understanding restorative justice. And I don't purport to be an expert on empathy, so it's really great that we've got Kimia joining this talk as well. But I just enjoyed, I've enjoyed thinking about the role of empathy in restorative justice, and the times when I feel that I've really seen it happening, and I put my own sort of thoughts around it, which I'm just going to share briefly with you today. So I guess the starting point really is at the point that a crime is happening, it feels that there's probably very little, if any, empathy going on in that particular scenario. So here you've got a young man who's probably not expressing or feeling a lot of empathy at that particular moment. And it would be a bit of a surprise if the woman who's at the the sharp end of that offence is feeling a lot of empathy as well. So at the very beginning, starting point with the crime, very little empathy is likely to be being expressed on either side. So if you could go to the next one. So I came up with this sort of diagram, which it's a slightly odd one, but it's just really showing that there's a kind of mirror image between the two. So if you have, they're both starting off their journey on the sort of low end of the scale in terms of empathy, but I've got those two as a sort of mirror image just to so we can kind of track their journey. But there's a big kind of gap between the two of them, so they're about as far away as they can be in terms of empathy. I think I've heard some people talk about this as being the empathy divide. So if you could go to the next one, Joy, thanks. So there's this this kind of gap which is created by the offence, by the crime. Next one. Sometimes, quite naturally and for very sensible reasons, the police kind of reinforce that gap. And I've had cases where people have said, I can't understand why, that they didn't come around immediately to apologise, to knock on my door. That would have resolved everything straight away. And it's quite likely, certainly in my world of youth justice, is that the police would have said, for safety reasons, you ought to keep away. You're not to have any contact with that person. So sometimes that sort of development of empathy after an offence is actually stopped by the criminal justice system itself. Next slide. So I like this image that Joe came up with of a sort of ravine between people, where there's no communication, no contact. Next one. And there's also, it doesn't mean that nothing's happening for either side. And there's a lot of sort of agencies that can get involved, both with the person who's caused the harm, the crime, and the person who has been harmed. So in terms of the person responsible, they might be getting into the criminal justice system. There might be a lot of interventions being given to them, including health and welfare services as well as the criminal justice case. And the same might be the case for the person who's been harmed. Next slide. And this one is just making the point that although the criminal justice system likes to see things, in a very clear way in terms of the person who's 100% responsible for it, and they're often up in court, we do know, all of us, that a lot of crimes are much more opaque than that. And there's things like joint responsibility or shared responsibility. So I believe that restorative justice actually allows for some of those complications and can kind of work with that in a way. And that's a lot of the cases we work with in youth justice. It's not quite as clear cut as someone who's 100% responsible and someone who's 100% innocent of that situation. Next. But there needs to be a little bit of a time after the offence. So here, you can see that there's not going to be a lot of empathy immediately afterwards. So there's a bit of a time where I like this idea of sort of unripe restorative justice, and there needs to be that time for reflection and time for remorse before you can start exploring a restorative process. Next one. And sometimes the restorative thing can be managed badly. So I think the apology letter is is a potentially risky business, and I've had situations where people have been sort of sat down to write an apology letter, which isn't very genuine because they didn't feel that they had a choice whether they wrote that. And then if that's kind of transmitted not very carefully to the person who's been harmed, then it can actually cause more damage and more harm than good. Next one. I've had a lot of cases where actually it's not so much about empathy. It can be more about a kind of mutual deal. So again, if a lot of restorative justice for me is also it's about just risk management, making sure that there's an agreement that there won't be further harm. And sometimes you can actually get a really positive restorative justice outcome without there being that development of empathy. That's not, the sort of sharing of stories and so on isn't really the agenda. The agenda is, let's just have an agreement that there's going to be no further harm. And that can suit both sides equally. Next one. A lot of people try, and I've done it myself, to write victim empathy courses. And that's a kind of pale, for me, it's a kind of, it can be useful. It can be useful in preparing people to sit down and get, come together in a restorative meeting as part of the preparation, but it's nothing like as good as the real event in terms of developing empathy. Next slide. And sometimes empathy, might be flowing from one party, but not from the other. So a lot of restorative justice doesn't progress very far because it takes two to tango. Next slide. And even if people are willing or interested in meeting, they have to overcome, quite a lot of anxiety often, because it's quite a big task. It takes a lot of courage to actually sit and face the person you've harmed. So there's this idea of a threshold of confidence. You need to, and the work of the practitioner to kind of lower those walls to the point that, that person has the confidence to walk over them. Next slide. And often the anticipation the night before, I've had so many cases where people have had sleepless nights, got, panic attacks and really worried about it. And they kind of come up with these images of the person they're about to meet as being this, mad axe murderer, because the last time they met them was a really horrible experience for everybody. And I just take my hat off to the courage of these people who actually engage in this restorative process, particularly for more serious crimes. Next one. And sometimes just seeing that person, can change everything. I remember a case that I did with it was a death by dangerous driving, and a mother met with the young man who had killed her son in this accident. And she had built up this image of a callous boy who had run away from the scene of the crime and didn't care. But actually immediately she saw him, she saw his suffering, the fact that he wasn't a happy young person, and he wasn't, he was gutted by what he did. And I just feel there was a massive change for her, and empathy started to flow. Next slide. So I drew it out as a kind of map where you can see that they're both moving together, moving towards the center of the graph. And where I think that anybody in this room is probably likely to think that likely to have stories or maybe even experiences where people have really come together and that gap has been properly closed, sometimes by a hug, sometimes by a handshake, sometimes through verbal, kind of apologies and so on. Next one. And people realize somehow that they're carrying the same burdens, and that the offense has been horrible for everybody. And the sharing of people's feelings, thoughts and feelings in that restorative process can really, for me, that's the thing that develops empathy, and how quickly that empathy can develop in a very short time. Next one. And realizing that their needs are very similar or the same as well. So that's my slides, and I hope you enjoyed seeing the brilliant cartoons from Joe Wilkins, and it started us off on thinking about the role of empathy in restorative justice.
Thanks, Pete. That's so helpful to set that scene and start thinking about how it all works, sort of almost in a timeline of how it might happen. Wesley, I'd be super interested to hear your reflections. Obviously feel free to comment on any of that, but also just in your personal experience, in your work, what has been sort of your impression of that interaction and connection of empathy and restorative justice, and how do you have it in your mind of how they can work together?
First of all, I'd like to say good evening to everybody. For me, I believe empathy is the key to rehabilitation. Empathy worked very strongly for me. I've done a few courses. First of all, let me introduce myself. I'm a senior mentor. I'm a senior mentor and facilitator working with young people at risk of crime or criminal justice system. That could be through grooming or exploitation, county lines, etc. I first got involved with restorative justice because I was actually a harmer myself. And I've committed many crimes over the years. But you see, when someone is sent into custody, a lot of work is done around remorse. And most 95% of prisoners are sorry. And they're sorry because they want to go home. They don't, the whole learning of empathy isn't taught. And that's what happened with me. See, I was taught the word empathy, and that kicked in for me my whole rehabilitation and my journey of change. Like I say, I believe that empathy is the key to rehabilitation, because there's a saying when they say charity starts at home. So when we kick in the empathy, we're able to work with the harmer to not show just the harm that they've caused to their victims, but the harm that they've caused within their own home as well. Their kids, their mum, their dad, people that they care about and love. And once we're able to work on that part of the empathy, we're able to slowly kick in the remorse and make them think how the victim would have felt. Luckily, I work in a school which is a restorative school. So me already being a practitioner, I'm able to carry on my restorative work. I was a practitioner within HMP Peterborough. I embedded restorative approaches into that prison. Well, I helped embed it into the prison. and I became a champion, and I'm able to still carry on that work in the schools. And I see it all the time, you see, because when you have someone asking the question, what was going through your mind, what was you thinking, how do you think the other person felt, you're able to bring the two people together, and they empathize together. So I have a very strong passion when it comes to empathy, because like I say, I believe it is the key to rehabilitation.
Thank you. That's really helpful to think of it in that way. You mentioned talking about sort of it starting at home and sort of helping people to start thinking about empathy by thinking about the people possibly closest to them that they might be able to sort of more easily empathize with. Are there other ways of sort of introducing empathy and helping people to start thinking about that, which you found is particularly helpful or effective?
Yeah, well, it works. Like I say, it works in both ways, because we could do it on an approach. So obviously, with restorative justice, a crime has to occur, and a restorative approach, an incident has to occur. And empathy can work on both sides. It can work. I believe that for any sort of restorative conference to work, we have to empathize together. So that means the harmer and the harmed, both of them, have to be able to show empathy, and even the practitioner as well. Because if not everyone is working together around empathy, then like Pete said, it will not work.
Yeah, thank you. Is there anything else that you'd like to share before we move on, or is there anything else in your mind about the topic that you want to talk on before we move on?
No, that's all right. That's me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's really helpful to frame this discussion in a really practical way. Kimia, did you want to share your slides and talk us through some of the work that you've been working on?
Hi, yes, I would be happy to. Hi, everybody. Just to quickly introduce myself while I set up my presentation. Here we go. Let me know if you can see this screen. Okay, yeah, okay, great. So I can see all the faces while also seeing the presenter view. Okay, cool, yeah. So as Joey mentioned earlier, I'm a doctoral student at Stanford. I study social psychology, but kind of more specifically, my focus is on issues around punishment, prejudice, and empathy, particularly in the education system and also the criminal justice system. Mostly focused on the school to prison pipeline, but we work both with, law enforcement institutions and also educators. All right, so once I got the invitation to participate in this panel, I accepted an invitation right away because I like Wesley and Pete also hinted at, I believe that empathy is really at the core of restorative justice and any sort of rehabilitation. So I wanted to start off by talking about why empathy specifically, and that's because as we've gone over so far, restorative justice heavily relies on empowerment, reintegration, growth, and personalization and humanization between the involved parties, all of which really depend on close contact and the development of empathy and perspective taking, or rather perspective getting from one another, right? Okay, so yeah, to define empathy, there's really two core parts of types of empathy. One is cognitive empathy, which is taking the perspective of other people. And then we have affective empathy, which is having concern for other people and their experiences, as opposed to simply taking the perspective of their position. Empathy can be nurtured through intergroup contact, and greater empathy typically corresponds with lower prejudice. By the way, please let me know if I go over time. I want to make sure I leave time for the panel discussion, but I haven't timed this, so please stop me at any time, Joy. Okay, so as again, Pete hinted at this earlier, intergroup contact has been shown through plethora of research to offer one of the most promising pathways to advancing social justice by creating greater psychological investment in people and groups outside of our own. So the more contact a person has, the more stronger intimate contact a person has with somebody that is outside of their immediate group. That could be, somebody that has committed an offense, or it could be somebody of a different racial group. It could be somebody that is in a different age group than you. The more contact we have with those outgroup members, the more empathy we build regarding the outgroup, and the more anger or frustration we may feel in their place when they are treated negatively. And that anger kind of feeds into more support and engagement and collective action for justice, supporting that outgroup. To go back, so there's been psychological interventions have been used for a long time to create large and sometimes quite lasting improvements in various domains like education, parenting, voter turnout, everything you can think of possibly. But most often these sorts of interventions are targeted at the stigmatized or stigmatized individuals, or those who are negatively affected in that setting, right? But today I wanted to talk about this sort of empathic intervention literature that focuses the intervention specifically at the gatekeepers or the individuals who are in the influential position in the relationship. That could be, again, educators or officers or practitioners, right? The intervention targets them to set the tone of the relationship and change the context and determine the outcomes. That way, both parties are engaging in that perspective getting and kind of collaborative problem solving together, as opposed to one person doing it at the other, right? Yeah, so the empathic concern intervention, which I will go to shortly, presents a new frontier for revised interventions to shift the mindsets of a few to improve life of outcomes. Again, by targeting the gatekeepers as opposed to individuals, we're able to kind of see results at an aggregate level. So as I said, my research focuses primarily on education and criminal justice. So I'm going to kind of like cover both of those areas with two major sort of studies, new recent studies from our team that is focused in K through 12 education with teachers and also probation and parole officers. So first, starting with empathy and education, Okonofua and colleagues developed a psychological intervention, a very quick, brief online intervention that teachers completed. So how this looks like is, Pete mentioned earlier that the apology letters, for example, are not, they can backfire very easily. That is absolutely correct. So the key thing when it comes to these sorts of interventions or trainings is, one, we don't really call them interventions, right? We kind of, the intervention is presented as a sort of, let's say, article that the practitioner reads, engages with that article, internalizes the values that are presented in the article, and kind of is reminded of the intersections between the values that they're reading about and the values that they actually have internally pre-existing before reading that article, right? So as opposed to us telling them what to think or what to value or what to write about or what to apologize about, it's more so the person taking that intervention, coming to those conclusions on their own and being able to have agency and take power over their words and their responses to the follow-up questions. So in the empathic discipline work in education, teachers read one of two brief articles. So they're randomly assigned to two different groups, and the people in the treatment read specific type of article, and people in the control condition read a different type of article that is not expected to show any effects. So in a treatment condition, teachers read about how good teacher-student relationships are critical for students to learn self-control. that is the empathic mindset condition. And then in the control one, they read an article focusing on how punishment is critical for teachers to take control of the classroom. Following them reading and responding to some engaging questions with these articles, the teachers are asked to review 3 like typical minor incidents, like 3 like vignettes of people, students kind of misbehaving in the classroom, and then they're asked how they would respond, how would they discipline the student. Lastly, they report the likelihood they would consider the student a troublemaker. And then, yeah, so we just very quickly, I realize I'm kind of short on time. The teachers in empathic mindset condition are found to be less punitive and more empathic and less likely to label the student as a troublemaker. They're also found that that the students of those teachers who completed the empathic mindset intervention were half as likely to get suspensions in the year following the intervention. So the suspension rates were quite literally halved within a year period by the teachers simply completing this 30-minute online intervention. Here, also talking about in a different study, they looked at how likely the students are to perceive as teachers that their teachers respect them, and how motivated they are to behave better in the future. And they found that, you know, in the empathic discipline condition, students are more likely to be motivated to want to do better because they believe that their teacher respects them more. Okay, just quickly moving on to the criminal justice sector. We developed a similar intervention for probation and parole officers. Here we worked with in a huge department of probation and parole in the United States, and one of the most in one of our states that has like the most rates of supervision for people under probation and parole. We worked with over 200 probation and parole officers, also supervisors and administrators, who supervise around 20,000 adults on probation and parole. We again had them read either a treatment, article or a control article. The treatment focused on officers' critical role in ensuring that their supervisees meet the condition of their sentence. And the control kind of focused on using technology to better manage tasks for work. So something that we wouldn't really expect to particularly lower, improve conditions for supervisees. Then the officers completed an activity about, again, their values, the most important reasons why they became officers and why these values are important to them individually and as a group. And then they read an article about how creating mutually respectful relationships with supervisees allows officers to be more effective in meeting the needs of supervisees. So the rest of kind of the materials focuses on the importance of building strong relationships with people they supervised and a very constructive feedback giving kind of dynamic. Yeah, so discouraging the view of supervisors as mere numbers, and encouraging officers to value how respected the supervisees feel. And they also did a hypocrisy exercise, which we don't need to get into right now. So in short, the empathic supervision intervention encouraged a mindset that can more productively sustain strong relationships with a potential to mitigate violations and recidivism. Because those were our outcomes of interest. I will go into kind of like results quickly, but we were looking at the likelihood for supervisees to violate the terms of their probation and parole, and how likely they were to kind of recidivate following the intervention with their probation and parole officer, and also looking at how likely the officers are to collectively blame their supervisees for the active FU. Yeah. So we did this by, again, highlighting how seeking the perspective of a supervisee can build trust in the officer-supervisee relationship, and how that trust can allow officers to be more effective in reaching their goals. their personal goals, not our goals for them, which is, again, I think is very crucial in these sorts of interventions. Okay, so for effects on violations and recidivism, please don't be scared of those numbers. The intervention significantly reduced the proportion of supervisees who violated the terms of their probation or parole, and as compared to the control condition, the officers who completed the empathic supervision intervention, the supervisees under their care were 13% less likely over the course of the following 10 months to recidivate. So I can, if you all have any questions, I would love to like dive deeper into that, but I will just make like a little parentheses here that the really important part with these sorts of interventions is this sort of long-lasting effect, because they build on a sort of like self-feeding like cycle that of you know, the intervention with one person can affect how people under their care are they feel, and then how their behavioral outcomes in real life looks like, and then that in turn affects how the person in the position of influence perceives other people in that position, right? And how they work with them in the future. And yeah, so we can see these results lasting for at least 10 months post-intervention, which is incredible, and 13% reduction in recidivism is very difficult to, you know, achieve. We also saw that the officers were less likely to collectively blame supervisees in the treatment compared to the control condition. I have a quick slide on future directions, which really touches on what both Pete and Wesley already talked about, so I won't take too much time with that. It is, again, just I would love to see like more partnership between academics and practitioners, so we can really use intervention, like evidence-based models for restorative justice and psychological interventions, because there's so much great work already out there. Knowing how these little skills and trainings can help in different domains, but putting it all together would really be able to get at the context as a whole, as opposed to each individual, right? So changing the culture around education, changing culture around rehabilitation, as opposed to working with one individual or with one, you know, couple involved in a situation. Let's see if there's anything else here that yeah, then this means taking the institutional context and individuals' construals in mind when implementing restorative justice. And I would just like to leave with this wonderful summary by Apato, 1996, which says that for people within our scope of justice, moral rules and values govern our conduct such that we care about their rights and fair treatment. But by contrast, for those outside our scope of justice, concerns about rights and fairness seem irrelevant, and we instead view those others as non-entities, undeserving or expandable. And that's why, again, we come back to the role of empathy in humanizing and just more contact with one another, and more intimate conversations and relationship building. Yeah, that is it for my presentation.
Thank you so much. It's so interesting to hear about the impact that sort of I guess empathy work with authority figures, but that impact has on the people that they sort of oversee or have some sort of leadership over in some way. So that's really, really interesting. I'd not really fully grasped a lot of that before. We're going to come to a question and answer time now. So if you haven't yet put any questions in the chat and you want to, feel free. One question which I already saw, which was very interesting, from Catherine. She says, good evening to everyone. A question for all the panelists. Can you describe your thoughts on how to work with shame when it's a barrier to the development of empathy and therefore any subsequent restorative processes as well? Wesley, do you have any ideas on that, how to sort of combat shame?
Sorry, I was on mute. Shame, it comes from self-worth. Once you get past, I can't actually see nothing. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, how to deal with shame is that comes with just growth, I believe. It's a very hard one when it comes to shame, because often they can feel like they've let their family down. But I think shame comes alongside being remorseful. So we have to get past that.
Yeah, thanks. Pete, did you have anything to add on that? I know you've done a little bit of thinking about this topic in the past.
Yeah, I completely agree with Wesley about it being about self-worth. There's an awful lot of emphasis in the justice world on trauma-informed practice. And I think there's a natural kind of succession to that, which is shame-informed practice. And I think Catherine's, put the nail on the head here, thinking about the central importance of shame in the lives of people who we're working with. So Brené Brown, most of you will probably know that Brené Brown made a nice distinction between guilt and shame. She said guilt is I've done something bad. Shame is I am bad. And that's a really difficult thing to shift, because that will come from very early life experiences and the kind of core negative belief that we all grow up with, actually. So it could be a core negative belief that I'm bad, everything I do is wrong. Brené Brown also said that empathy is an antidote to shame. And I think the fact that this wonderful restorative justice process builds empathy, particularly in people who may not have had the conditions to develop empathy as children, I think is a really hopeful sign for the future. It's a very healing thing. I guess I believe I've seen situations where it's almost like the shame has been burning off, not completely obviously, but you can see shame turn into pride. And sometimes it's such a big personal task to come to a restorative meeting and to face up to the person you've harmed or who's harmed you. And you can see some of that shame. It feels like it's dissipating, that it turns into pride. I've actually managed to do this. I've done the right thing. Maybe I'm not such a bad person after all.
Yeah, thanks. Kimia, is there anything else you'd like to add?
I will just quickly touch on, I guess, two things. One, labeling, and two, growth mindset. I think with shame, a lot of the shame comes from this sort of labeling that happens in our, in our society, with having committed a violation of some sort and then being labeled as your violation, as an offender or as a criminal or as a juvenile delinquent, right? I think just kind of more of a shift towards identifying people as people first, and those acts as part of their experience as opposed to their identity is very helpful, and not kind of exacerbating that shame that's going to exist no matter what, right? And it can hinder their people's ability in engaging with restorative justice sort of work. Another thing is growth mindset, and this idea that like people can change. That comes with intelligence, that comes with rehabilitation, that comes with addiction, that comes with everything, right? And it's very important in the sort of restorative justice work to continually remind the individual of their ability and their ability to change. Well, first, their overlapping values with the values of society, right? Like whatever violation that has been committed, most often the individual is on the same page, with the social norms or legal rules that it has violated. So first, reminding them of those overlapping kind of values, and then two, reminding them of their ability to use that as a moment in time, and then not as a reflection of all their past and all their future, and to really internalize this idea that they are able to move past that and kind of take pride in changes that can come out of it, if that makes sense.
Thanks, that's really helpful, all of you. Vince, you have your hand up. Is there a question or a comment that you'd like to contribute?
Well, Can you hear me now? So, yeah, it's more of an observation than a question, to be honest. I just want to thank all three presenters for what they presented. I'm going to be honest and say I'm here today because I'm intrigued to hear people talking about empathy. I come to empathy as an agnostic, and perhaps even a bit more stronger than that, a disbeliever in some ways. But that's partly because, and I did appreciate kimia offering a definition of empathy, because my experience is this is a concept we all talk about as if we know what we mean by it. But quite often we have different understandings and perceptions. To talk about perspective taking, people take different perspectives and perceptions around empathy. And particularly with criminal justice staff, I can think during the 90s and the early noughties, sick and tired of hearing youth justice workers and yacht workers telling me that this young man has low empathy. And then I asked the question, how do you know? Have you plugged him into the Youth Justice Board empathy measuring machine that gives you some sort of definitive estimation? And of course, there isn't a Youth Justice Board empathy measuring machine. People make estimations on the basis of presumptions without using clinically recognised rating tools or measures. So I think, sorry, empathy is a potentially quite dangerous concept because it's poorly defined. It is also poorly measured in that sense. We don't have any forensic, we can't do a blood test and say this is 3.2 on the empathy rating scale. We do that through our own perspectives and our own understanding about what we're talking about. And because it's poorly defined, it's often described in metaphor. We talk about in other people's shoes. When we talk about something in a metaphorical sense, part of the reasons we do that is because we struggle to define it or to identify the parameters and the limits of it. So I'm being an agnostic by simply saying I don't disbelieve in the concept of empathy or the power of that, particularly with regard to restorative work. But I think we have to be honest to say that there isn't a widespread understanding and agreed definition amongst practitioners. There is no widespread methodology for estimating empathy. And my understanding is there is very little hard-nosed, evidentially based research to show that there is any correlation between empathy and recidivism or lack of empathy and rates of recidivism. And we can follow that up by really thinking about, again, in the early noughties, in the UK at least, all that time and energy that was spent on empathy programs of empathy building. But did they have any correlation in terms of reduced offending rates or recidivism? It's never been demonstrated. So it's a little bit like a concept that's difficult to define, it's difficult to measure, and we don't really know if it makes much difference anywhere. So that's the bad news. I've got that out of my system and sort of expressed all that, some might say cynical issues, but I do think it has a real power in terms of a protective factor, in terms of building greater emotional literacy and skills and capacities in relationships. And that in itself is a well-proven protective factor in terms of reducing reoffending and increasing desistance. But I think it's only part of that broader concept about emotional literacy and particularly emotional recognition and regulation. It's one element, if you like, it's one brick in that particular wall, which can be very useful in terms of building people's capacity to both gain employment, to build relationships, to establish relationships which are not short-term and abusive, but long-term and nurturing. And they're the factors that often, with an offender going into adulthood at least, are the types of things that actually pulls them away from pro-criminogenic behaviours. So I think a little bit like denial, I think in restorative justice, we need to have a much more sophisticated approach to empathy rather than heavily invested in this sort of old 90s idea that we increase the empathy, reduce the risk. I know in my own particular field with adolescents who are sexually harmed, there is absolutely no correlation at all between empathy, rated empathy levels and risk of recidivism. It's extremely difficult to demonstrate that connection for all the reasons I just mentioned above. But that doesn't mean that it's not important in terms of the quality of a restorative approach. And I'm thinking there really about Meredith Rosner's work on the microdynamics within a restorative engagement. And she talks about solidarity and cohesion. And I think one of the routes towards achieving solidarity and cohesion is being open to the experience of others. Now, whether we want to call that affective empathy or cognitive empathy, you know, there are different ways of looking at that. And I'll just finish with this thought. I was really fascinated with Kimia's presentation, because it strikes me that demonstrates something that we've known again for the past 30 years. If we look back at Kelly's work in the 1990s, when it was looking at the quality of the relationship between a probation officer or youth justice worker, criminal justice practitioner, and the young people they were working with. And it was evidenced even then, it was the quality of that relationship which massively impacted on the quality of the intervention. And workers who were unable to build empathic relationships with, if we want to use the word clients, but with young people, generally had poorer outcomes in terms of their interventions, using exactly the same programs. So the quality of the relationship with the worker is the factor here. And I really welcome what Kimia was talking about with teachers and with particularly youth justice workers, because that might be something that they've tended to forget over the past 20, 30 years. The relationship is key. And part of that key of that relationship is your ability to be able to model empathic behaviours and understanding. You can't teach empathy, you can model it. So, I mean, that's not a question really, it was just, I wanted to have a little rant out of my head really.
Yeah, thank you.
Fascinating presentations, fantastic.
Yeah, thank you, lots to think about there. I'll come to the panel for their kind of comments on that. First of all, we've had a comment from Rosie saying, I understand there are validated measures of empathy, so perhaps Kimia could comment on those. Is that something that you have had some experience of? What are sort of the ways that you maybe can or can't measure empathy? Is that something that you could speak on, Kimia?
Yes, I first just wanted to say thanks to Vince for that comment / question / rant. It's a really great point. And I think it's not talked about as often, and it ties back well to my kind of slides about how we need more partnerships between practitioners and psychologists, right? There are widespread validated empathy measures for measuring empathy, and also training empathy. It's kind of difficult. The last thing you said about like teaching, you can't teach it, but you can model empathy. I don't know where I stand on that. That is a difficult philosophical question for me personally as a doctoral student, but I do know that there are widespread measures, both like self-report and other types of measures for empathy in different ways. Like there's multiple different ways to kind of look at empathy again. Like it could be perspective taking, or it could be having concern for, how other people are treated. It could look like anything. And there are validated measures for that that are widely used in psychology. I don't believe that they are as often used when, restorative justice is kind of implemented on the ground. At least in the US context, we really don't have those partnerships as much. So not a lot of psychological measures are kind of distributed in those contexts. It's more so of like one-on-one dynamics and like procedural, systems. So yeah, I do believe that it would be great help if those two could combine and we could use each other's kind of understanding of the context to design the most helpful practices. When it comes to evidence of empathy being helpful, again, at the core of almost every big social issue, we see that like it comes down to the strength of the relationships between people in position of power and people who are negatively, affected within the social context. And that's not just with crime, and that's not just with restorative justice, it's with everything. It's with sense of belonging in a group, it's with racism, it's with sexism, it's with everything, right? So, and there's again, a lot of evidence around that. It's just a matter of, again, taking that evidence from those different domains and testing it out in this specific context. I hope that answers most of
Yeah,
the
no, that's helpful. Thank you. Wesley, do you have anything you want to contribute?
I kind of, well, I understand looking at the time. I kind of agree with Kimia, but empathy, I believe, is something comes from within. Yes, it can be taught, but it also has to come within. And when they have to be ready. Nothing can be taught if someone isn't ready.
Yeah. Pete, was there anything you might want to add?
Yeah, I was just reflecting on what Vince was saying and about the importance of the practitioner. And I think we are the tool of our work, and we need to do work on ourselves in order to be the best possible tool. And I'm fascinated by Kimia's talk about greater empathy typically corresponding with lower prejudice. And I think it's a real, my understanding of unconscious bias, which can build into prejudice, is that we're more likely to revert to our unconscious bias if we are multitasking, if we're hurrying, if we're doing too many things at once, if we're distracted. A little bit like how we lose empathy for other people as well. And I think the restorative practice that I try and develop in myself is about slowing things down and trying to be fully present. And that lovely idea about deep listening. So you're not listening in order to reply, you're listening really because you're genuinely curious and want to learn about the other person and their perspective. So I think as practitioners, we can do an awful lot to develop our own empathy. And I love that idea that in doing so, we can model empathy and help, I don't know, bring about more empathy in the world, and through humanizing other people, as has been said.
Yeah. We're running out of time. We've had several really interesting questions, so I don't think we're actually going to be able to get to all of them, sadly. But what I did want to pick out was from Teresa. Question is, any creative ideas of how to work on empathy towards police officers from young people and vice versa? We are trying in my team and finding it very challenging. For example, you mentioned humanizing, which is something she sees some, at least short-term positive outcomes from. Any of the panelists have any thoughts? I think particularly Pete or Wesley, in your work with young people, you might have any suggestions.
For me, the problem we have with empathizing, getting young people to empathize with police, I wouldn't say just police, I like to say authority. Young people sometimes have a problem with authority figures, and this can come from social workers, school teachers, doctors, and even sometimes it's taught from within their home. So it's a very hard barrier to break down empathizing, getting young people to empathize with authority. However, what I like to do is just try to teach that we are all human, beyond the prison number, beyond the uniform. We're all somebody's son and somebody's daughter. And then once we kind of get past that barrier and just trying to build trust, that's the main reason I believe that a lot of people don't empathize along with police and teachers and authority figures, that it's the trust. So once they build up on the trust barrier, and then the relationship can hopefully be built.
Thanks, Pete. We're running out of time, but any last thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't know if I can express this properly, but I think there can be a risk that we try and individualize a conflict between between a young person and a police officer, for example, where it might be a much more systemic issue, and that's a bit problematic, I think, because it's almost like you're expecting the young person to reach out and mend a relationship with an individual where they might be living in really deprived situations where there's systemic racism, for example. So that's just something to be cautious about, I think.
That's really insightful. Thanks, Pete. Just a final comment on that. Leanne has put something in the chat saying that there's an organization, I think in the USA, working on that called Strategies for Youth. If you go to strategyforYouth.org, there might be some information there on that as well. We have unfortunately run out of time. It's been really wonderful to have this conversation. I think we could probably carry on for quite some time. So maybe a follow-up conversation is in order to explore some of these themes more. We would love it if you could quickly fill out an evaluation form on today's event. It would really help us to plan future events, hear what it is that'd be really helpful for you and useful for you. So I've just put the link in the chat. If you could click that, that'd be great. Then at least if it's open in your browser, even when Zoom goes away, it'll be there ready, ready to be filled out. It's really, really short, but we'd really love to hear your thoughts on that. I will also email that link hopefully tomorrow with the recording as well of tonight for those who missed it or want to listen again. We also have upcoming events and we're still finalising some of the finer details, but we will in the new year have events on where next for restorative prisons or restorative justice in prisons, and where next for restorative policing. So if you're interested in those topics, keep an eye on our website, keep an eye on our social media for all the details. The dates are in the diary, but all the finer details are yet to be ironed out, so you can't book just yet. But it's been really wonderful. Thank you so much to our panelists, particularly for all of your insight. It's been really, really valuable. And Kimia has also put there in the chat that she'd be happy to continue the conversation. So she's put her email address there. So if any of you want to reach out about anything specific, please do that. And thank you so much for joining us and hope to stay in contact with you. Thank you all. Goodbye.